For nearly 2 years now, Kenya's opposition has repeatedly echoed one central belief about the 2027 presidential election, that defeating President William Ruto is simply a matter of unity. It sounds simple, but beneath that confident assumption lies a question the opposition has struggled to answer. Not how to unite, but what they're uniting to defeat President Ruto for. Defeating a sitting government is difficult, everyone understands that. But the real challenge comes afterward, because voters are not just asking whether the current government should go. They are asking a far more uncomfortable question. Is the alternative actually better? And that question becomes harder to answer when the coalition promising change includes figures like Mithika Linturi, dismissed from the cabinet of William Ruto after the fake fertilizer scandal. At the recent funeral of veteran Kirinyaga politician Daniel Karua, something remarkable happened. Nearly the entire constellation of Kenya's current opposition figures appeared in one place. Among them were Uhuru Kenyatta, Rigathi Gachagua, Fred Matiang'i, Kalonzo Musyoka, Martha Karua, James Orengo, Eugene Wamalwa.
But perhaps the clearest articulation of the opposition strategy came from former Interior Principal Secretary Karanja Kibicho. His message was simple: unite, and Ruto goes home. It is a compelling political formula, but it leaves one critical question unanswered.
Political coalitions are not unusual in Kenya. In fact, every major election since 2002 has involved some form of alliance. But historically, coalitions have often formed around ideas: economic reform, constitutional change, governance transformation. The current opposition coalition appears to be forming around something much simpler: removing one man from power, and that creates a fundamental challenge. Winning an election cannot be an end in itself. An election victory is supposed to answer a deeper question, and voters ultimately ask a much more practical question. What happens the day after the victory? What direction will the country move in next? Yet so far, the Kenya opposition's central message has been remarkably thin. Ruto must go, Kasongo, Ruto wantam, which leaves voters asking, and then what? Another uncomfortable reality quietly sits at the center of this emerging opposition coalition. Their financial and political gravity appears to revolve around one figure: former President Uhuru Kenyatta. This creates an awkward perception problem, because if the coalition succeeds, many voters could interpret it not as the arrival of a new political direction, but as the return of an old, tired one. The Kenyatta dynasty has ruled Kenya for a quarter century with very little to show in terms of meaningful reform and positive change. And this is where the political conversation becomes extremely uncomfortable for the opposition. Because once Kenyans begin comparing the Ruto administration to the Uhuru administration side by side, the debate suddenly changes. And the opposition has been very careful to avoid that comparison. Not because the numbers are unclear, but because the numbers raise a question that could completely reshape the 2027 debate. Under President William Ruto, Kenya's economy has stabilized, inflationary pressure has moderated, and Kenya's credit standing has strengthened. The opposition frequently accuses the Ruto administration of serious failures. Among them, corruption, police brutality, abductions, high taxation, and the rising cost of living. These are weighty accusations, but strangely, the opposition rarely engages in a blow-by-blow comparison with the previous administration. Which raises another uncomfortable question: why avoid that comparison? Because once the comparison begins, a very ugly picture emerges. Many of the very problems now being highlighted, corruption scandals, rising debt, police brutality, abductions, high cost of living and high taxation, did not start under William Ruto. They were already entrenched and were in fact much worse during the presidency of Uhuru Kenyatta. Kenya's staple food unga is now retailing at between 40 to 60 shillings lower than what it cost when William Ruto took over from Uhuru Kenyatta. And in several cases, the economic constraints facing Kenya today are direct consequences of decisions made during the Uhuru era. Take taxation, for instance. And one of the loudest criticisms today is that Kenyans are being taxed heavily. But taxation rarely emerges in a vacuum. Taxes often follow debt. And Kenya entered the current administration with record levels of public borrowing accumulated during the presidency of Uhuru Kenyatta, which means the uncomfortable truth is this. A large portion of the taxes Kenyans pay today are servicing obligations created by the previous Uhuru Kenyatta administration, which means many of today's fiscal pressures were not created by President William Ruto. They are the long-term consequences of decisions made years earlier. Another policy contrast appears in how each administration approached the cost of living. Under the previous government, subsidies often appeared at the point of consumption. The Uhuru government often attempted to cushion consumers directly. Subsidies at the fuel pump, subsidies on supermarket shelves. Under the Ruto administration, the emphasis shifted toward production, lower fertilizer costs for farmers, adjustments to fuel procurement mechanisms, and structural reforms in sectors like housing, healthcare, and education financing. Whether one agrees with these policies or not, the contrast is clear. One strategy attempted to temporarily suppress prices. The other attempts to sustainably alter production costs and supply, which brings the debate back to the opposition. And this is where the opposition's biggest challenge begins to emerge. Their greatest challenge may not be unity. Kenyan politicians have always known how to unite when elections approach. Their real challenge is something far more difficult: to find a credible narrative to sell against President William Ruto. Because defeating a sitting president requires more than just assembling familiar political faces on the same stage. When voters walk into the polling station in 2027, they will not simply be choosing between familiar politicians. They will be choosing between two versions of Kenya's recent past. And the comparison becomes more complicated when many of the opposition's most influential figures were themselves at the center of the previous administration. So as the 2027 election approaches, one question will gradually dominate the political conversation. Not, can the opposition unite? But rather, unite to do what? Unite to implement which policies? Unite around which economic philosophy? Unite behind which development model? Unite to build what kind of Kenya? Because if the answer to all those questions remains unclear, then the slogan Ruto Wantum risks sounding less like a governing vision and more like a campaign built on nostalgia. And nostalgia is rarely a convincing blueprint for the future. In politics, removing a government is often the easiest part. Replacing it with something clearly better is a much harder test. And as 2027 slowly approaches, that may be the question that ultimately decides Kenya's next election. Not whether the opposition can unite, but whether they offer a markedly better alternative to the government of President William Ruto. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our Kenya2027 Watch channel to help us bring a large number of Kenyans into the conversation. We're here on a serious mission to separate the facts from the propaganda.